Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something pretty interesting. How mainstream media, all the stuff that we see every day, affects our happiness. But don't worry, this isn't going to be all doom and gloom. We're going to give you some practical advice on how to deal with this and make yourself happier.
Yeah, it's incredible how much media shapes how we view the world and even ourselves, like a lens that we can't take off.
That makes sense. So, what's the actual impact of all this media? Does just watching a couple extra hours of TV every week really make a difference?
Well, the research actually shows that all the negative news we are exposed to can make our brains think negatively. It's something called negativity bias. Basically, our brains are hardwired to focus on threats. It was super useful back in the day to avoid predators, but now it makes us more likely to feel anxious and just overwhelmed by all the negative news.
Oh, wow. So, our brains haven't caught up to the 24/7 news cycle yet. Still reacting like there's danger around every corner.
Exactly, and that makes it way harder to be happy.
And it's not just the news either, right? Social media can be just as bad. It's so easy to get caught up in comparing yourself to all those perfect photos and videos online.
You're totally right. Those beauty standards and lifestyles that we see online are completely unrealistic. And when we compare ourselves, it makes us feel like we're not good enough.
Ugh, yeah, I know what you mean. It's like everyone online is living this awesome life. And meanwhile, I'm just trying to figure out what's for dinner.
And then on top of all that is information overload, emails, notifications, news updates. It's nonstop.
Oh my gosh, you're right. I could feel my stress level
Yeah.
rising just thinking about all that.
I know, right? With all that stimulation, it's so hard to relax and focus. Our brains just need some time to chill out, but they never get the chance. It's like we're always on.
So it sounds like media can sometimes bring us down, but I'm guessing there's got to be a positive side too, right?
Of course. We have to remember that media is just a tool. And like all tools, it can be used for good or bad. It really depends on how we choose to use it.
Okay, I'm ready for some good news. How can we actually use media to be happier?
Well, think about documentaries. They can teach us about important things like mental health, or even just introduce us to new ideas and ways of thinking.
Yeah, I love documentaries that make you think differently about the world.
Exactly. And then there are also stories about people overcoming challenges. Those are super inspiring. It reminds us that no matter what, we can get through tough times.
Yeah, it's like they give us hope when we need it the most.
And then there's the social aspect. Even with all its problems, social media is still a great way to meet people and be part of a community.
So media can be both good and bad. It just comes down to being aware of how it affects us and making good choices.
Exactly. We need to be conscious about what we're consuming.
So how do we actually do that? What are some ways to be more intentional about the media we use?
First, think about the media you use most. Does it make you feel good, or does it leave you feeling drained and anxious?
Hmm. So it's like being mindful of what we're feeding our minds.
Exactly. And if something is making you feel bad, maybe it's time to unfollow or switch to something different.
That's a great idea. Kind of like decluttering our minds.
Right. I like that. And speaking of making space, we should also set boundaries with media.
What does that look like?
It's simple. Just make some time in your day where you're completely unplugged, like no phones at the dinner table, or maybe an hour before bed without screens.
I've actually been trying that lately,
Yeah,
and it honestly makes a huge difference. I feel less stressed and I sleep better.
that's awesome.
Yeah.
It's all about deciding how you want to spend your time and attention.
Okay, so we've talked about being selective and setting boundaries. Anything else we can do?
Definitely. We should practice something called media literacy.
Media literacy. What's that?
Basically, it's about thinking critically about the information you see in the media.
So instead of just scrolling through my feed without thinking,
Hmm.
I should pause and ask myself if the information is accurate.
Yes, you need to think about where the information is coming from and maybe what their goals are.
Wow, so it's like being a detective for information.
Exactly. You're becoming a pro at spotting misinformation.
I love that.
And it's also really important to look at things from different perspectives. Don't rely on just one source of information.
So basically, get the full story.
Exactly. And remember, the media is constantly changing, so we need to keep learning and adapting.
Okay, so we've got being selective, setting boundaries, and practicing media literacy. Any other tips?
One more. It might sound cheesy, but it works. Focus on gratitude.
Gratitude. How does that help with all this?
Well, when you're constantly seeing these perfect lives online, it's easy to forget about all the good things in your own life. So instead of thinking about what you don't have, try to focus on what you're grateful for.
So I should be thinking about all the things I'm lucky to have.
Exactly. Think about your loved ones, your health, your accomplishments, even small things like a nice meal.
Wow, that's actually a really good point.
And last but not least, let's not forget about all the good media out there.
Yeah, there's got to be some, right?
There's tons. Think about the shows that inspire you, the podcasts that teach you new things. Surround yourself with media that makes you feel good.
So it's all about choosing quality over quantity.
Exactly.
And speaking of quality, we have a great story coming up. It's about someone who used all these tips to change their relationship with media and become a lot happier. All right, so we've been talking about how to be more intentional with our media choices and like creating a more positive experience, but to show that it's possible. We have a really cool story coming up. It's about someone named Sarah. She's 30 years old, and she was feeling totally burned out from social media.
Oh, yeah. I think a lot of people can relate to that. Sarah was spending hours on social media every day, comparing herself to everyone else and just feeling overwhelmed by it all was really starting to affect her happiness.
I can imagine. So what did she do to change things?
Well, she decided to actually try out the tips we've been talking about. She started by unfollowing all those accounts that made her feel bad about herself.
So like a social media detox, but instead of quitting completely, she just got rid of all the negative stuff.
Exactly, and she replaced them with accounts that made her feel happy and inspired.
That's a great idea. What kind of things did she start following?
All kinds of stuff, like gardening, healthy recipes, inspiring quotes, anything that made her feel good. She also started following accounts that focused on self-care and body positivity. That really helped her to feel better about herself.
Wow, that's awesome. So she basically created a happier online world for herself. Did it actually work?
It totally did. Sarah said she felt way less anxious and more content with her own life. It even motivated her to start some new hobbies that she'd been putting off.
That's so inspiring. It just goes to show that we really do have the power to control our happiness.
I agree. Sarah's story is a great example of how even small changes can make a big difference.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into media and happiness, what's the one thing you want our listeners to remember?
That's a good question. I think the biggest takeaway is that even though media can be really powerful, we don't have to let it control us. We have the power to choose what we consume and how we let it affect us.
That's a great point. We can create a media experience that makes us happy, not stressed.
Exactly. It's all about being mindful and making conscious choices.
Awesome. Well, that's all the time we have for today. But before we go, we have a final thought for you to consider. What's one small change you can make today to create a more positive media experience for yourself?
It could be anything. Unfollowing a negative account, setting some boundaries with your phone, or even just taking a few minutes to appreciate all the good things in your life.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic.
Until then, take care of yourselves.
All right, so we've talked about all these tips and how we can use them in our own lives. But I think it helps to see how someone else did it, to make it seem more real. So let's meet Sarah. Sarah is 30 years old, and she was feeling super burnt out from social media. Can you relate?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think Sarah's story is pretty common these days. She was spending way too much time scrolling through her feeds, comparing herself to everyone else, feeling overwhelmed by all the information. It was definitely affecting her happiness.
Yeah, it's so easy to fall into that trap. So how did she actually turn things around?
Well, she decided to actually try out some of the tips we talked about, put them into practice. She started by unfollowing any accounts that made her feel bad, like the ones that made her feel jealous or not good enough.
So she was being more selective about what she was seeing.
Yeah.
But she didn't just stop there, right?
Right. She also started following accounts that made her feel good.
What kind of stuff?
All sorts of things, like gardening, healthy recipes, inspiring quotes. Basically anything that brought her joy and lifted her spirits. She also followed accounts that focused on self-care and body positivity.
Oh, that's so smart. So she was basically creating a more positive online space for herself. Did it actually make a difference?
Absolutely. Sarah noticed a huge shift. She felt less anxious, more content with her own life. And get this, it even inspired her to start some new hobbies. Like she always wanted to start a garden. And now she finally had the motivation to do it.
That's amazing. It's like a real-life example of how these tips can work. It really shows that we have more power over our happiness than we think.
I couldn't agree more. Sarah's story is such a great reminder that we can all make these changes, and that even small changes can have a big impact.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into media and happiness, I think the key takeaway is that we don't have to be passive consumers of media.
Right. We have the power to choose what we consume and how it affects us.
And by making those choices consciously, we can create a more positive and fulfilling relationship with the media we use.
Exactly. It's about being mindful, setting boundaries, and finding what truly makes us feel good.
So here's one last thought for you to chew on as you go about your day. What small change can you make right now to create a happier media experience for yourself? Because even the smallest changes can make a difference in the long run.
That's so true. And remember, your happiness is worth it.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a blast exploring this topic with you, and we hope you've learned some valuable tips and tricks along the way.
We'll be back soon with another exciting deep dive, so stay tuned.
Until then, take care and be kind to yourselves.